afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We're certainly happy to have all of you here, many of you again, and I hope you'll continue to keep coming. This presentation is part of the programs of the White River Valley Historical Society, of which this museum is a part. We also have in Forsyth a museum and research library. We exist on the basis of memberships and donations, and we hope that some of you who are not might like to become members of the society to help support these and other programs. And we do also publish a quarterly magazine. And these presentations are the work not only of the speakers, but of a very helpful and important committee of Chris Bohintz, Linda Burlingame, Curtis Copeland, and Ann McDowell. He also and is also responsible for the beautiful graphics of all our posters. Our next program is, by the way, and you'll have an opportunity to pick up one of these at the table outside, is entitled Putting History on the Map, presented by Curtis Copeland, a great cartographer who also happens to be here with us today. A number of years ago, there was living in here a person known as quite a character, Chick Allen. Well, we find that he's been reincarnated. We have another quite a character. We have John Fullerton, who is a singer, and guitar player, expert and historian, so quoted. And I think we'll find out that's exactly the case. John, we'll be very pleased to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I've had about 15 of you already ask, are you going to sing? No. But we will do a little bit of an opening number. Everyone always asks, what is the difference between cowboy music and country music? And country music is inside songs, as we say in the business, lying, crying, cheating, and dying. So therefore, that will not be happening at all, I promise you that. The great cowboy songs are, of course, about the great American West and the wide open spaces, and the Sons of the Pioneers literally invented all of that musically. And Bob Nolan was one of the geniuses. He wrote Cool Water and Tumblin' Tumbleweeds, and as Roy used to say, the jillion other songs also. And this little song right here, Bob wrote, called Hold That Critter Down. Hold him down, burn his hide. There's extra pay for every day, so hold that critter down, burn his hide. Hold him down. When the sun goes down and the moon comes round to the old cook shack we're heading, we'll throw him high in the chinkook's eye and we'll tie him up in his bedding. Then we'll make him run to the tune of the gun, so hold that critter down, hold him down, burn his hide. There's extra pay for every day, so hold that critter down, burn his hide, hold him down. Back next day with 10 minutes pay left from the check that I drew. The boss says, son, you're a son of a gun, but I wish that I was like you. So I'll burn hair for next month's pair and hold that critter down, hold him down, burn his hide. There's extra pay for every day, so hold that critter down, burn his hide, hold him down. You're the lady, oh, I need a loo. You're the lady, oh, I need a loo. You're the lady, oh, the lady, yeah, the loo, the loo, the lady, the lady. There you go. So when all of this took off, and I just want to briefly start today by giving you just a brief outline of the pioneers' beginnings in Southern California, because it really paved the way for all the future cowboy performers and songwriters to come along. It's just amazing the influence and the impact that the Pioneers' music has had all these years, and the fact that the guys are still together after 85 years of continuous performance. And I've been very blessed to, for the longest time, just to watch along the sidelines and see it all happen. And then nearly 2 years ago, be asked to actually become a Pioneer, and I'm their 45th member in all these years that they've been together. And it is an honor, absolutely. I want to back up to 1985 for just a moment, because that was the first year the Pioneers came here to Branson, and my grandmother was working next door for Joe and Sylvia Reich when Reich Shoe Store was in the other location. And one of the Pioneers at that time in 1985 walked in and dropped off a pair of boots for repair, and that was the great Sonny Spencer. And a lot of you remember Sonny. He always had a smile on his face and had a great quote for literally any situation. He drops off two things. Number one, his pair of boots for repair. Number two, a Sons of the Pioneers poster advertising that they were performing at the Lowe's Theater on Highway 76. This was a 900-seat venue, and the fellas signed a deal to do 123 consecutive performances, and they sold out every one of them for that 1985 season, doing, I believe, 6 nights a week at times, and it was just unbelievable. So how I fell into all this, my grandmother is just going crazy that there was a member of the Sons of the Pioneers in the Reich Shoe Store. She just couldn't believe it. And I still vividly remember, and this is my dad's mom, by the way, I vividly remember I'm in the 2nd grade. I get off the school bus on a Friday afternoon, and my grandparents were next door to us over here on Highway 165, and I just simply went next door to tell Granny that I'm home from school. Hey, I'm ready for the weekend. She greets me at the back door as I come up to the porch, and she says, "I got us tickets for the Sons of the Pioneers." That meant absolutely nothing to me at that particular moment. I thought, the what? The who? You know, I had my Friday night all ready to do nothing, and next thing I know, we're going to a Branson show, or I thought it was a Branson show, but I was mistakenly wrong once we did get there, and the curtain opened, and here are 6 fellas in cowboy tuxedo suits doing exactly what my family was involved in. They were singing about cattle and horses and coyotes and the whole 9 yards, and they had this beautiful 3-part harmony blend on everything that they sang. Now, I had been around harmony singing because my grandparents had their own gospel quartet, so I had that influence going on, but these Pioneers, man, they stepped it up a notch. And I was catching every little detail, but the one thing I remember vividly the most about seeing the Pioneers the first time is my grandmother, 3 seats over from me, is on the edge of her seat the entire time, and she is in cheerleader mode, just a hoorah, and keeping the audience going, and leading the hand clapping, and driving everybody nuts that was sitting around her, because that's how Granny is. And she did one thing that particular evening. She picked up their Cool Water album. They were still selling the long play albums at the shows back then, and still to this day, Cool Water is the best seller of all the Pioneer recordings. It was recorded 60 years ago this year, June of 1959 at RCA Hollywood. So she manages to meet all the guys at halftime too. I was scared to death and very shy in those days, and I didn't want no part of it. So she gets their autographs, and they took the pleasure of signing it. And I was given the album by my grandmother after the performance, and I spent the next 3 or 4 months observing all 18 songs and what they were doing. And of course, I knew that the band I was hearing on the album was not the band that I had just seen on stage, as there's been a few personnel changes through the years. But fell in love with that, and by the time I was in the 3rd grade, I had all 18 songs memorized. And then my grandma realizes, hey, he's got a real interest in this. She gets into the closet one day, and out comes this rather large cardboard box, and she pulls out for me the following: her 1944 Roy Rogers songbook.
Oh my God.
And her brother had picked this up at Ike Martin's music store in Springfield, and that was the place to go for all the sheet music and all the 78 RPM records and everything. And so Uncle Efton, her brother, and my grandmother literally wore this thing out. And so inside was Tumbling Tumbleweeds and Twilight on the Trail and some things, other things that were also featured on the Cool Water project. And so I had that going, and spent all my spare time just digging a little deeper and digging a little deeper. And my mom signed me up for the Pioneer Fan Club when I was 10, and the rest is history. So, wow, yeah. There is Ozarks connections, as I have said, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here for a few moments. But in the early 30s, when the guys got this all together in California, and by the way, the table in the very, very back, way back there against the wall, kind of has some unique features and memorabilia on life in Los Angeles, and the original 4 pioneers that all came together. Only one of those 4 did have a Missouri connection. We'll talk about him here in just a few moments. But Roy Rogers was the real go-getter who just simply wanted to get a group together on radio that could sing harmony and do it right. He was just absolutely terrified to sing solo on radio. And he started out in a band called the Rocky Mountaineers and begged them to allow him to add harmony vocalists. So in Los Angeles, they had the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper back then. And so Roy places an ad in the classifieds under theatrical, and it says, "Harmony yodeler needed, baritone preferred." And so Bob Nolan answered that ad. Some time went by, and Bob felt, there's no money in this, I'm going to move on. So he goes to work at the Bel Air Country Club carrying other people's golf clubs. And so another ad shows up, and Tim Spencer sees it, and Tim answers that one. And now this would have been about 1932. And again, very little in the way of money in this. And you look at these photos back here and see how skinny these guys are. They are starving, I kid you not. It was difficult to get a paying musical gig in Southern California at the time. Tim answers the ad, shows up for an audition with Roy, and says, "I've always wanted to try to yodel. Can you show me how?" And so Roy shows Tim the tricks to yodeling very simply, and within moments, Tim is a yodeler, and Tim gets the job. Tim was born in Webb City, Missouri. His dad was a mining engineer, and Tim went into that line of work as well. And unfortunately, he was involved in a minor accident that did some damage to his lungs, and that's why, and years later, Tim always had the weaker singing voice in the Pioneers Ensemble. But Tim got into music and trying to find a way to get out of the mining career. He went over to a little saloon at the time in Webb City called the Bucket of Blood. Sounds like a great place, don't it? Yeah. Tim goes in there with his little banjo and sits on a stool up above the bar and sang for 2 hours and made $17 in tips. He was just a teenage kid at the time, but he was hooked and he had the bug. Tim's older brothers were living on the family ranch outside of Springer, New Mexico, and eventually in 1930-31, some of those Spencer boys went to California. And Tim was working for the Safeway grocery store organization in their warehouse when he saw the ad in the Examiner that Roy had put down. Tim still to this day also ranks right in there as another one of the great Western songwriters, and he had never written a song until he got involved in the early days of the Pioneers. He only strictly got into songwriting simply because Bob was doing such a great job at it, and Bob was dusting off poetry that he had written in high school in Tucson, Arizona, taking poems and simply doing the rough part of adding musical to an already existing lyric. And that's how so many of these fine songs were born. So the guys went over and I call it bought an audition at the Warner Brothers radio station. Now, where did Tim come up with this one? I don't know. But Tim and the guys show up for their Warner Brothers get-together to audition for the Warner Brothers crew, and Tim pulls out of his pocket, and this is in 1933, he has 3 $50 bills in hand. And that's huge money in the Depression. Goodness sakes alive. And he lays that down on the station manager's table and says, we would like to audition. Well, the guys had worked up this beautiful song that Bob had written about a hobo on a freight train. And to pull off the part of the freight train in the song, they go into this 3-part harmony freight train yodel and a song called Way Out There. The guys get into it, and within a minute or so of doing that number for their audition, the station manager conducting the audition walks out of the room and leaves the 3 fellas there still singing away. Bob Nolan said in an interview, he says, when he turned around and left the room, my heart plumb sank to the floor. He thought, phooey, we didn't get the job. Seconds later, the manager comes back with one of the Warner boys and says, you got to hear this. And that's where it really took off. They signed them up and said, come to work in the morning, we're going to give you a 15-minute spot. And most of the live radio spots in LA at that time were always at least a 15-minute show. But they went in just continuing the rehearsing, continuing to get that sound developed. It did sound rough, but one thing going for them, those three fellas had precise breathing, they had precise phrasing, and there was no one else in Southern California singing like these guys. They decided to call themselves the Pioneer Trio at that time because they all felt that they were of pioneer stock. Roy was a native of Southeast Ohio, and Bob Nolan was actually born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, but grew up for a spell in Boston and then relocated with his father in Tucson, Arizona when he was about 12 or so. And that's where Bob fell in love with that great American desert, started writing all those poems. And then one morning they stepped up to the microphone, and by now they're doing 3 or 4 broadcasts every day at Warner Brothers, and the announcer thought, we need to pull a little prank on these guys and see where it goes. So the announcer, Harry Hall, he stands behind the mic and says, ladies and gentlemen, here they are, the sons of the pioneers. And the fellows stood there with blank looks on their faces, wondering why did he pull that off. Finally, they got it all together and sang way out there and finished the show, but afterwards wanted a simple explanation. And the announcer says, you guys are so youthful in appearance, you don't look like pioneers, you look like the sons of the pioneers instead. And they thought that one over for a moment, decided to keep the name. The other thing that had happened shortly before that, they added a fiddle player, so there was actually 4 of them in the group now. So that, of course, they didn't look like a trio by any means. That's where it all took off for them. Now let's get into Gene Autry here for just a second, because while this is all going on, Gene Autry has just been signed a movie contract with a firm called Mascot. That was the name of the movie studio, and it was owned and operated by Mr. Nat Levine. And Nat Levine had under contract a very well-known superstar at that time who made a great name in the late 20s and early 30s doing westerns. His name was Ken Maynard. Ken Maynard just didn't really have the voice, but against the studio's ideas and persuasion, they bring Autry to have a guest spot in this Ken Maynard feature, and Autry, of course, outsang Ken Maynard unbelievably, and they didn't even realize what they were doing at the time, and so Levine gives Autry his own spot. Soon, some other things change, and Mascot becomes Republic Pictures, with the help of some other individuals, and Republic just went bonkers in producing cowboy films. They had this idea during the Depression that, you know, let's put something on film that cheers everybody up, but let's throw something else in there that's never been done. Let's throw in some quality music and just give everyone a moment to, you know, take their mind off of all their troubles, as the Depression was just so bad in so many areas at the time. So Autry begins climbing the ladder at a salary of $75 a week for this outfit, and at that point, national recognition starts coming their way. Gene Autry took Bob Nolan's "Tumbling Tumbleweeds" and recorded it. Gene's recording actually happened to be his second million-selling record, and the "Tumbling Tumbleweeds" movie that they produced, when it came out in November of 1935, it cost $15,000 to produce. Its income that it brought in was just a little over $500,000, actually just shy of $600,000. And all of these early Autry films, with he and his best friend Smiley Burnett, were all bringing in major pocket change to theaters all over the country. And we're going to talk about that here a little more in depth as we go along. KWTO up here in Springfield, Missouri, was one of the big outfits to start showcasing live talent. And KWTO, those call letters actually stand for Keep Watching the Ozarks. And they hit the airwaves Christmas Day 1933. And they put out a newspaper piece advertising, hey, we want live talent. We are not going to play records. We want to do our radio programs live, as many as we can fit in throughout the day. And a boy from up here in Nixon, Missouri, by the name of Slim Wilson, and I've got some things on Slim Wilson in the middle of the room on the big table there. Slim Wilson is running cattle on his little Nixa ranch and only has about 40 acres in his possession at that time. But he had a musical family all the way around, and he urges his sister to join him. And they start a little trio with some other dear friends and call themselves the Goodwill Family. And so they start doing their daily programs. And the pioneers in California had two big things happen for them. Number one, they signed with Decca Records. And that was 85 years ago this month, August of 34. And at that same time they signed with Decca, they signed up with a gentleman by the name of Jerry King, and Jerry King owned a radio transcription service called Standard Radio. And Mr. King says to the pioneers, I want you guys to come in and put down as many of your songs, your original numbers, other favorites that you guys, want to handpick, throw them down. We're going to put them on record, and we're going to market these nationwide, make them available for purchase to any radio station that wants to do it. So they ended up over the course of 2.5 years laying down well over 225 numbers. And these were made available. KWTO up here in Springfield sees the ads for Standard Radio, and lo and behold, they purchased the entire set. And that's what got the pioneers, to being heard in this area at that time. And some time goes by, and they record a second series. Well, Slim Wilson up here at KWTO is tuned in, and he is catching every one of these broadcasts. And they would set them up to make it sound like the pioneers were actually behind the KWTO mic, even though they weren't. But the DJ would read off of an index card everything about the song that was about to take place. And some of them were 15-minute spots. Some of the programs were 30-minute spots. But the phone started ringing. KWTO gets calls day in and day out for this California bunch, the Sons of the Pioneers. Well, Slim Wilson starts a new group, and he calls them the Prairie Playboys. And so they get their own broadcast, and all they're doing is singing Gene Autry material and singing Pioneers material. And they were on the air sometimes 4 times a day, doing a fresh show every time they got behind the microphone. And Gene Autry is still making his movies, and all of a sudden, little by little, it keeps stair-stepping upward in effect, and this new singing cowboy genre is just boom. It's what everyone wants to be a part of, and it's what everyone is paying the 7 or 8 cents at the theater to see. And that's where some of the problems started taking place, especially with the practices in movies at that time. And by 1937, Autry was just a little bit unhappy with the way some of the practices were going, and I want to talk about that for a moment. I took some notes on just exactly what Autry's salary began at and where it went. So as I said a moment ago, Autry starts at $75 a week in 1934. After that first year, they raise him to $100 a week in 1935, and from there, they give Autry raises of $50 a week every 6 months. Now, Gene renegotiates his contract in the summer of 1936, and it is agreed that he will receive now $2,000 for every film that he is doing, and he's doing 8 of them a year. But he demands that he gets 100% of the income from his personal appearances, because prior to July of 36, anytime Autry went out on the road to promote what he was doing, he had to give 50% back to the movie studio, and he did not like that one bit. So they got that stopped. And then in 1937, his salary is doubled to $4,000 per film. But the issue that he wanted completely wiped away was the practice of blocking. And what Republic would do is, if you were a movie theater, let's take Jim Owen across the street, for instance, here at the Owen Theater. Jim Owen buys from Republic Pictures the block that he's going to show for so many weeks, and it's a block of 20 films. Of the 20 films, 8 of them are Autry Pictures. Jim Owen gets it all in place, and guess what? Autry is the top one. No one else even bothers to come and see the other films. And it's this way with every little movie theater, and there are over 7,500 of these theaters all across the U.S. playing these cowboy Autry westerns. And of course you've got others too. You've got Tex Ritter, who's just been introduced at this time, and Bob Baker is over at Universal, and he's making films. And then this other young man who hit it really big, Hopalong Cassidy, and even John Wayne is just starting out with Lone Star. So all the studios had their cowboys, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But Autry wanted this little blocking practice stopped because it wasn't fair. Autry's belief was, hey, the movie theater should have the right, a theater owner should have the right to pick what he wants to show, because they know what's making the best money, right? And so that was Autry's look at it. Autry demanded from the Republic executives, mainly Mr. Herbert Yates, and I don't want to say much about him because it seems like everyone's got the most negative Herbert Yates story in the world, and I'm not gonna get into that. He was a little bit on the difficult side to deal with. I'll leave it at that. So they get into the squabble, and Autry stormed into his office one day demanding that this blocking practice be stopped, and Autry said years later, he says, maybe I shouldn't have went in there and done that. But because of Autry's attitude and everything, he stormed off the set and told Herbert Yates, I won't be returning to work Monday morning. And of course they all thought that was a joke, that, oh, Autry couldn't be serious, he'll be here. Because they were ready to start production on a new Autry film that was going to be called Washington Cowboy. And here comes Monday morning, and there is no Autry, and the next day, Tuesday, rolls around, no Autry in sight. Sure enough, he has saddled up Champion. They've got their stock trailer tied up to his Buick, and they're out on the road. And time goes on, and Herbert Yates decides, well, we'll just suspend him and hire somebody else. That was a trick to try to call him back to the studio to come back to work. That didn't happen at all. And so, guess where Gene Autry comes to, of all places? Branson, Missouri. In that time that he was off, and this was from around October of 1937 until the following summer, around, probably August or September of 38, Autry did nothing but go out and tour. And he stops in here and talks to Jim Owen and expresses his frustration over the blocking practice that's been taking place, and he wants it to be done away with. And Owen, out of the goodness of his heart, says, buddy, you need to go fishing. So they got out here and did a 2-week trip together, and that was back when you could still float such a big majority of the White River, but they hit it off and became friends from that point on. And finally, Republic Pictures agreed to go ahead and agree to what Autry was asking for, and that practice was completely done away with nationwide when he returned to work at the end of the summer 1938. But they decided, we need to invest in a replacement to keep this going, so Republic Pictures hired Roy Rogers, who's 26 years old. And it's so amazing how that all fell apart in a way, because Roy says it was a miracle how it all happened. He was at Glendale at the hat shop, and a guy comes in, tears the door off the hinges, wanting a hat for a screen test. Well, it's Republic Pictures that's doing the screen test to replace Autry. And so this happened to be like on a Saturday or something, and Roy says, I'll just go down there and see what's going on. Well, now you got to understand, Roy Rogers and the Pioneers at that time had already done 2 Autry films, had provided music, and Roy did not have his little employee gate pass with him that particular morning that he goes down to scope out the situation. And he goes through the Republic gate and looked around, walked out, comes back after lunch and says there's got to be a way to get in, and he sees a group of extras coming back from lunch. They're all in their cowboy duds, and Roy's got his hat on, and he pulls his hat down low and kind of snuck in through the gate with all the other guys and got in there, and he hears someone call his name, Mr. Sly, because that's Roy's real name still at that time. He's Leonard Sly, the name his mama gave him, and Roy was just terrified because he thought it was the security guard coming to pull him out of there for good. It actually was one of Gene Autry's producers, Mr. Sol Siegel, who saw Len Sly come through that gate, and he's walking across the Republic lot, and Mr. Siegel says, Are you here for the screen test? Because we've tried out 17 guys today, and we don't like a single one of them. Where's your guitar? Well, of course, Roy's got his guitar 2 blocks away in the car, and go get your guitar, So he comes back, and he took off in a sprint. And when he comes back, he catches his breath and sits down and does Tumbling Tumbleweeds and a little yodel song that he just dearly loved called Haiti Brown. And again, they were just blown away that they'd never given him any thought. Well, anyway, they signed him up to be a contract player. The date was October the 13th of 1937, and they start him at $75 a week. But they took very good care of him, was very careful with the investment, and Mr. Yates at Republic says to the folks at the American Record Company, and that was ran by Mr. Art Satterley, and Art Satterley was a character, and he spent a good amount of time putting a lot of young performers down on record. And Satterley is told, I want you to record this young kid and get as many singles out of him as you can. So they took Roy immediately into the studio. They cut his 4 sides and only ended up releasing 2 of them. The other 2 was left on the shelf and kind of forgotten about for a while. But that was America's introduction to Roy Rogers, and they start working on his first film. They changed the name of it from Washington Cowboy to Under Western Stars. And that thing took off, and it premiered in Dallas. And the rest is history. Autry comes back later in the summer of '38, as we said, and it goes on from there. So what an amazing tale. All this time, though, things are still booming up here at KWTO. And a buddy of Gene's by the name of Jimmy Long kind of steps into the picture. Jimmy has written some pieces with Autry, and you would almost think that Jimmy Long and Gene Autry were like father and son, but they weren't. They had actually became acquainted some years prior when Autry was working as a telegraph operator for the Frisco Railroad in northeast Oklahoma. Autry came through Springfield with the Frisco. Jimmy Long was transferred to Springfield thanks to the Frisco, and they simply just played music together. And Autry goes to New York to try to cut some records, and he does, and none of them were thrilled with the way he sounded, because they want trained singers, and Autry wasn't that at all. But Autry comes back through and falls in love with Jimmy Long's niece, Miss Ina Mae Spivey, and Miss Spivey is a college student at the Southwest Missouri State Teachers School in Springfield, so they tied the knot in like 1933. And so that was one of Gene's great connections to this great Ozarks area. And even as time goes on into the 1950s, Autry comes to Springfield frequently for guest spots on the Ozark Jubilee TV series. And all these KWTO people that were doing their thing, 1953 rolls around, and KWTO decides, well, we might as well catch up with the times. We don't want to do live music. We think we can save a ton of money by playing records. And so that's the move they went to. But they kept a lot of those KWTO musicians together, and they bring in Red Foley to do this big nationwide TV show, and it becomes the Ozark Jubilee. And that's really what put Southwest Missouri on the big map nationally with that weekly broadcast. It had the folks in Nashville at the Grand Ole Opry absolutely just furious, because everyone was leaving the Opry to come up here and relocate and make this television series boom. And every time they tried a televised version of the Grand Ole Opry, for some reason it flopped. And I don't really know why that might have happened that way. But Red Foley was a superb talent. I know a lot of you who grew up in the 1950s, you tuned in every week and saw Red Foley. Red Foley was a great voice. He was a little bit on the shy side too. He even had a lazy side about him. And get this, Gene Autry personally recommended Red Foley to replace him when he walked out on Republic in late 1937. And Red Foley didn't want nothing to do with it. Can you imagine that? If that would have happened, wow. But Red Foley was a superstar talent all the way, and the folks just loved him. But every time Red Foley had to go on the road, Rex Allen might get the call, Gene might get the call, Tex Ritter might get the call to come and fill in. And they kept some formation of the Jubilee on television nationally well up until about 1961. And then Slim Wilson ended up with the whole thing and ran it through the mid-70s. So there's some cool memorabilia back there in the middle covering some of Slim and some of Autry and his situation. Those standard radio transcriptions that I was telling you about that featured Mr. King, they were pressed on 12-inch 33s when they came out in 1935, and you can look on these and clearly see the directions. Start the needle on the inside, because that's the way they are. And I think their idea of that was because it would sound fresh as opposed to starting on the outside. How many times do you still play your long play records, kids? Because I do this all the time. You start on the outside and you get the most noise and static and surface sounds from the outside edge instead of the inside. I think that was part of the reason they did this practice for a while. was it sounded a little more clean, starting from inside, going inside to outside. And like I said, the Pioneers just did oodles and oodles of those, well over 200 plus songs as time went on. And by golly, even into the 1950s, KWTO would still pull them off the shelf and play them just to fill in airtime whenever they needed to, even though it was the original Pioneer lineup and they went through several members at that time. Young lady on the second row, we were talking about Ken Curtis when you got here a while ago, and Ken Curtis doesn't really have much of an Ozarks area connection. Of course, this is the guy that became Festus on Gunsmoke. He sang with the Pioneers all through the 1950s and just had an amazing voice and had his own singing cowboy position going on at Columbia during the Second World War, while Autry was a fighter pilot. And anyway, things go around, and Ken Curtis gets in with John Wayne. Mr. John Wayne's big producer was Mr. Ford, as most of you know, and Ford's daughter Barbara had a thing for Ken Curtis, and so Barbara and Ken tied the knot in the early 50s, and that's why you start seeing little by little, you start seeing Ken Curtis in these big John Wayne features. The Alamo is a great example in 1960. Of course, The Searchers is probably my favorite from that particular era, and it has some good music, and that's actually the Pioneers singing the opening theme to The Searchers. But Ken's Ozarks connections is Ken's mama was from down here in Green Forest, Arkansas, so all of her family came out of there. Ken's dad was out of Benton County, Colorado, and that's where Ken was born and raised and grew up, and his dad was the sheriff there, and if you ever go through that little town there in southeast Colorado, the Benton County Courthouse, it's still there, and the jail where Ken's dad worked is still standing, and it is just a neat little structure. Ken never dreamed that in the 60s and 70s he would be doing basically the same things he did in real life with his dad as a little boy when his dad was sheriff. I mean, Ken is like 8 years old and he's helping serve supper to prisoners. You know, it just doesn't get any better than that. So some neat stuff. I do want to take a few moments for Q&A and things of that nature, so if you have anything you want to throw on me, I know I've wrangled a lot of details on you in a short amount of time. And I do want to point out that my museum collection is available to view anytime y'all want to do so. I've got my business card back there. You can call me up, and if I'm home and not out on tour with the Pioneers, I'll be glad to bring in a few boxes of stuff and let you see things. And I've got so much stuff on the Pioneers. You can pick an individual member or a certain time frame or anything, and we'll make it happen. And I'm so glad we have a museum like this right here up and going. And believe you me, folks, you've got to support these museums, because if you don't, we're going to lose them. And I feel in my heart that that's what we've got to constantly do. There are some great properties in this town that are preserving our history in such a great way. And Jim and Jean, give them a round of applause, because they're doing such a fantastic job here. Love it. And I also can't stress enough the importance of what Leslie and the gang are doing in Forsyth with the home office there for the White River Valley Historical Society. And they got started in the early 1960s because there were people back then that cared, and there are still people there to this day that still care about that. And we've got several volunteers from the Forsyth branch with us in this room today. And thank you guys for everything you're doing and keeping our county history up to snuff so it doesn't get lost. That really means a lot. Who's got a question? I don't want to leave anybody out. Yes, sir, Dan?
Can you give us a short bio of the current Pioneers?
Okay, I can do that. So over the years, there have now been 47 members, and that's kind of a rough estimate. There's been several guys through the Pioneers' time who might have stayed for a few weeks or filled in, but they didn't get a member contract and stayed rather long. But the fellows who have really put in an effort, there's 47 of them that have come and gone in 85 years. And the fellow that runs the Pioneers now was with them when they first came here to Branson in 1985. It's Mr. Tommy Nally. He is the group's 4th lead guitar player in all these years that they've been together. But he acts as their trail boss and kind of keeps things rolling from the legal standpoint and tells us when rehearsal is and makes sure that the sound is sounding just the way it's supposed to sound. And Tommy's one of my buddies. And I met him that very first time when I was 7. And at the time he was the group's drummer. And that was something that they had decided to add on because they felt they couldn't keep up with the other Branson shows unless they added some other things to the sound, even though it kind of got away from the Pioneer sound for a spell. But over time, it came back around, and they're still doing it today. The Pioneers still utilize 2 guitars, a fiddle, and an upright bass for instrumentation, and everything is still performed vocally in that beautiful 3-part and sometimes 4-part harmony. And today we still sing Cool Water in the Pioneers in 5-part. And if you want all the parts wrote down, I'd be glad to do that for you. Anyway, so we got Tommy Nally, and then the boy that sings tenor way up in the treetops is a native Texan. He comes from a little place called Marshall, Texas. His name is Ken Lattimore, and Ken has been with the fellows now a little over 20 years, and just does a phenomenal job. And then we've got all us new guys in the Pioneers, and one of them here today, he sings the middle voice part, and to me he has just one of the most beautiful baritone voices in the world, and I love standing next to him and harmonize with him. Dusty Rogers is here today. Hi, Dusty. Glad to have you. In January 2018, Dusty got the phone call if he would be interested in becoming a pioneer, and about a week or week and a half passed, and I got the phone call, and boy, I tell you, it's just been, we're loving it, and just having a ball. We have a fiddle player from Seattle, Washington in the Pioneers, and his name is Paul Elliott. And he sounds so much like the Pioneers' original player, Hugh Farr. You put the two side by side, you would be blown away. And we've went back and made a great effort of bringing back a lot of the old Pioneers' fiddle tunes from the 30s and 40s. And there's hundreds of them. We'll never get around to all of them. It's just that in depth, the Pioneers' library of songs as all these years have went by. Our bass player, Mr. Chuck Irvin, is a boy that grew up in Mississippi and went for a degree in journalism up here in Columbia at MU, so he's a Missouri Tiger. But he ended up on the West Coast some time ago, and he plays bass out there, and we're thrilled to have Chuck Irvin as the Sons of the Pioneers bass player now. And so that's kind of the current lineup, and yours truly right here. I sing the baritone part and sometimes swap out with Dusty, and I'll give Dusty the middle part, and I'll sing the middle part. But we just have a ball together doing what we're doing. So that's kind of the current lineup, and you can go to sonsofthepioneers.org and check out our website. Yes, ma'am.